Member for Kamloops Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give the first response. I will be our designated speaker, but don't worry, to those at home, I won't take 2 hours today. I'll finish it up tomorrow, or I guess those in the gallery. First off, Mr. Speaker, I would like to echo what many in here have said today. Certainly my thoughts and prayers and hearts go out to everyone involved in Pentumbler Ridge and the families that have been devastated by the most tragic circumstances. And as the Minister said, it is a strange day indeed to still have to continue on with the business of government. However, that is the task at hand for us today as well. And Mr. Speaker, results matter with government. Track record matters with government, especially when you're judging a government on their words around a budget. And when this government and when this minister says what they are planning on doing, I think it's important that we look back even just 1 year to what the budget last year said this year was going to be. Because this is a 3-year fiscal plan, and this government is very good at telling us about their spending priorities over the next 3 years. And then you dig into it, and usually there's very little money in this year's budget and very little conversation about those programs in year 2 and 3 because they start to fade away into the sunset. It always sounds like there's going to be a lot of action. I remember a premier that promised K-3 classrooms all having teaching assistants in an election that we still haven't seen materialize. Always sounds good, but the result is never quite matching the marketing. So when you look at last year's budget and what the government projected this year to be, and then you look at this year's budget of where they're projecting things to be, revenues are down $200 million this year's budget compared to what they were thinking last year, so not horrible, relatively stable there. But the deficit has ballooned another $3 billion over what they were projecting just last year for this fiscal year. It is now a record $13.3 billion. I didn't hear the minister talking about that. Another record deficit on the heels of a budget speech talking about fiscal restraint and responsibility. On a budget that is built very clearly on the backs of seniors, of working families in British Columbia, and small businesses. That's the hard decisions that have been made by this government, Mr. Speaker. Cost after cost piled on to seniors, working families, and small businesses. And I'll dig into that in my comments here. A few other interesting notes from the second quarter update till now. One would assume they would want to keep some of these areas spending in line. Agriculture, down $16 million from the second quarter update to this year's budget. I guess food security and the fruit stand isn't quite as important as the minister might have led us to believe. Emergency management. Now that's a bit of a different animal in terms of spending when emergencies happen. So I'll just go by what they projected over last year, down $5 million. Pretty dry out there when you drive around this province. It's going to be a bad year. Emergency management's down $5 million. Environment. No wonder the Greens got rid of their agreement. The environment budget is down $10 million. Forestry budget. No wonder the minister didn't mention forestry. I don't believe once in her speech. If she did, it was a passing reference at the beginning. That ministry's budget is down $400 million from the second quarter update. No, that's the staff that are supposed to help revive the forest sector. Mining. The industry we're supposed to be ramping up for is down $13 million. Public safety, down $4 million. So we're hearing about what is going to be added to public safety. We haven't heard what's getting removed from public safety to pay for those changes. Because the budget's only a $4 million difference and actually down $4 million. Why spending decisions are so important and why debt and deficit is so important, those items I listed total about $450 million. That is half of the increase in the management of public funds and debt increase line item in this budget. That is what happens when the government spending is out of control, Mr. Speaker. Their ability to function is severely restricted. Now, I'll dive into the forestry piece in a little bit, but let's look at the full-on attack on seniors, on working families, and on small businesses that this budget is. Now remember, we talked about the teaching assistants that were promised. There was also a promised $500 person rebate, $1,000 household rebate. But instead of that, PST, provincial sales tax, will now be charged on basic cable packages for homes, on landlines for phones. Now, I know it's a bit stereotypical, but I would suggest most landlines are probably in seniors' housing people than living at home. Seniors watching their pension income are on basic cable, and those young families that are trying to make ends meet on basic cable. But no, this government wanted to dip into their pockets a little bit more and make sure they charge PST on services that had never been charged PST before. But they don't stop there, Mr. Speaker. No, in tough economic times when people are trying to make sure that they just have their shoes last a little bit longer or get their clothes repaired, this government is making sure they charge PST now on shoe repair, on tailoring services, on clothing patterns in case you want to be able to go and make your own clothing instead of having to go to a store, on yarn in case you're somebody who likes to knit something for your grandchild. You can now pay PST on that as well, Mr. Speaker, because this government needs the extra $100 million that will bring in between all of those areas. Property tax deferment. The minister talked about it as if it's a great thing. Well, it's interesting because that's going to bring in an extra $35 million from seniors. It used to be prime minus 2%. When this government took office, it was actually 0.7% interest charged on the property tax deferment. This budget now changes that to prime plus 2%, Mr. Speaker. That's a 4% swing in the interest charge on the property tax deferment program for seniors. 6.9% will now be the interest charged based on the current prime rates, Mr. Speaker. It was 2.9% before this budget was introduced. Low-income tax change. The minister says, don't worry about it. Really won't impact people. Really? That's an interesting way to look at things. It goes from 5.06% to 5.6%. on everybody's first roughly $50,000. What the minister doesn't want to mention, though, is that brings in $500 million, that tax change. $500 million. She also doesn't want to mention that the tax rates, the steps, the brackets, are frozen this year. Which means when this government wants to take a victory lap in June about minimum wage going up, to all you minimum wage earners out there, not only did your income tax rate go up, but you're actually going to pay it on everything extra you're earning as well, because they've actually frozen the tax brackets. That's slated to bring in an extra $600 million this year. So when the government members want to shake their heads that that's not real, they might want to look in their own budget document to see the $1.1 billion of income tax changes. Those two situations alone are going to pull out of seniors, on pensions, on hard-working families, on everyone in BC, under the guise of it's a minor change, don't worry about it. What else is being removed that's going to impact seniors and hardworking families, especially in resource communities? Well, the Northern and Rural Homeowner Grant that saw an extra $200 for the homeowner grant for everywhere outside of the 604 area code. Last I checked, that's a lot of resource towns. That $200 per homeowner is gone. So let's see, if you're a senior living outside of 604 and you're still trying to desperately live in your own home because there's no long-term care beds available for you, you just lost another $200 on your homeowner grant. You want to defer your property taxes, but it's gone from a 2.9% interest rate to a 6.9% interest rate, and your pension's just being taxed more. This is the NDP working for you, Mr. Speaker, if you're a senior. PST. The minister wants to talk about what they're doing with business. Let's look at the PST that's being added to businesses. And yes, at a time when businesses are desperate for help because of crime and safety and shoplifting impacts and need to hire security guards to be in their stores, this government has decided it's time to charge PST for security services. But wait, Mr. Speaker, I always feel like, I think he's actually running down in the States, that Vince guy. I feel like the ShamWow. But wait, there's more, Mr. Speaker. They're going to charge it on accounting services. They're going to charge PST on bookkeeping services. Mr. Speaker, at a time that businesses are pleading for help around crime and safety and cost pressures, this government has decided to essentially shoplift an extra $550 million out of small businesses in the form of PST changes. But nothing to see here, according to the Finance Minister. They're hard at work for you. Housing costs. The minister wants to talk about how they're working hard to bring down housing costs. Well, let's look at that with the PST added to it. Architectural services and engineering services for housing now will be subject to PST. Does this government honestly think that the home builders that are now having to pay PST on an architectural cost is going to eat that cost? Or do they think that that extra 7% is going to get passed on to the new homeowner or renter? Once again, a full-on attack on seniors, on hardworking families, and on small businesses. Now, I mentioned forestry with a $400 million cut to their ministry budget, Mr. Speaker. Now, again, this is a minister that has overseen a lot of pink slips going out in the forest sector. Apparently, according to the books, he'll be overseeing a lot of pink slips going inside of government for a change within forestry, but they won't actually tell us where the cuts are going to come. So spending within the ministry is down $400 million. In 2022, this government collected $1.8 billion off of forestry in forest revenues. They've done so little to react to the downturns and the pleas from industry. This year, revenues are down to $500 million. They're not taking action. They can say they want to grow the economy all they want. They've watched this slowly decline from 1.8 million to 800 million to 600 million, now to 500 million. Year over year over year. That's just from 2022. No response to industry, no creativity, no way to try to not only bring up government revenues, but save all those forestry jobs. Nothing. They have one thing in here. They're going to let you defer your stumpage for 11 months this year. You'll still owe it, and you still need to pay it, but at least they'll let you have a little bit of cash flow for a few months. In 2022, again, same year as the $1.8 billion, this government said they were going to add 30,000 jobs in the forest sector. We have lost 15,000 since 2022. That's a net non-deliverable promise of 45,000 jobs in the forest sector by this government. That's how badly they're failing the forest sector. It's not just the dollars to government of $1.3 billion loss. It's the 45,000 jobs they haven't even come close to delivering on that they continue to promise and stand here and expect us to believe they have a plan forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to read a quote from the seniors advocate. The impact of not increasing the supply of long-term care beds to keep up with population growth over the next 10 years will have a profound impact on emergency rooms, hospitals, family physician offices, seniors, and families. That's in response to the long-term care beds we're short of 16,000 by 2036. So in this budget, the government's doing everything they can do to put a financial pressure on a senior trying to live in their own home still, while still having a 16,000 deficiency of beds for long-term care by 2036. So you would think this budget would actually accelerate long-term care beds, Mr. Speaker. But there is no plan to meet demand. In fact, on page 64 of the budget, there are 6 long-term care homes listed that are now TBC. I can assume that means to be cancelled. They were previously announced. They previously actually had completion dates in the budget. Everything else in the budget is the same except for the completion date. So in Abbotsford, instead of a 2027 completion date, this government now has TBC. In Campbell River, instead of a 2027 completion date, it's now TBC. In Delta, 2027 long-term care bed completion date, TBC. Chilliwack, 2029, TBC. Cottonwoods, 2029, TBC. And Squamish, 2030 is now TBC. They can't even promise something in 2030 still, Mr. Speaker. Now, normally, if a capital project's going to be delayed, they just put a new year in. And this government's very good at doing that because everything's delayed. They're very good. They're used to doing it. And in fact, any changes in that capital plan is supposed to be highlighted. It's supposed to be bolded. This government didn't want us to notice the TBCs because they didn't bold that. If it had changed from a 27 to a 28, it would have been in bold, but apparently going to the never ever plan, it doesn't need any scrutiny. And in fact, and this one might interest you, Mr. Speaker, the Burnaby Hospital Phase 2 that's supposed to be 2030 as of last year's budget is now TBC. It's being reevaluated. And the interesting thing is the dollar figure of the projects that are being reevaluated that have been previously announced by their own language in this year's budget matches up close to the dollar figures when they're talking about capital being delayed, capital not being pushed out. In fact, when we want to talk about capital and infrastructure, it's very interesting. The overruns of the current capital plan from when they were first announced is now, last year was at $15 billion. It is now at 17.3 for that list of projects. $17.3 billion over budget on $80 billion worth of projects. 25% over budget. And the interesting thing is, they are now 158 years behind schedule. No wonder we're now seeing TBC. They quite literally, in the middle of a seniors' housing crisis for long-term care beds, have ceased to even try to pretend there's a deliverable date on 6 projects. And a hospital. Burnaby Hospital Phase 2 on the indefinite plan. And why does this matter? Because the most secretive government in Canada, that routinely gets called that, has an interesting change to how they are going to bring forward legislation this spring, Mr. Speaker. They're going to change the Budget, Transparency and Accountability Act, because those words certainly don't match with an NDP government. And right now you have to declare any project over $50 million. But not this government. They find it too onerous to actually be forthright and not only tell people if a school is being built in their community, but what date they could reasonably expect that their kids could enroll in that school. So instead of just even going to the TBC and leaving the project in the budget book, which at least would be a little bit of transparency, they want to change the legislation to account for inflation since the year 2000 and change the threshold of declaring a project of $50 million in capital spending to $100 million. Now, they haven't actually come up with the dollar figure, because it's kind of like when they wanted to change the FOI laws, and they kept saying, well, we got to consult. We don't really know what the number is for filing fee. We'll have to do more consultation. And then they signed off on the $10 fee about 15 minutes after it was passed in the legislation. This is open-ended. They don't want to tell us what it is. It says for future. But, you know, a pretty quick search in your phone tells you what inflation from the year 2000, what 50 million would be worth nowadays. It's in that 100 million ballpark, but they can't even be forthright enough with that, Mr. Speaker. Why it matters is the public has a right to know what projects are being planned in their communities, because this is a government that in this budget has another $5 billion in contingencies. And they're using all the same language. Because they didn't get all the contracts negotiated last year that they needed the $4 billion in contingencies for, they need another $5 billion this year to keep working on the public service contracts that they say they're going to actually cut 15,000 people out of. Something's not adding up. And if they didn't need the full $4 billion because they needed it all, according to the minister last year, the lion's share of it, to deal with the contract negotiations, why do they keep saying that there will be no money left of the $4 billion? And this is why it's important around that scrutiny piece on the $50 million. The contingency funds under this government, under this premier, have turned into a slush fund. There is no scrutiny. They can go out after budget estimates are over, and they can approve through Treasury Board another project, another sweetheart deal, something else that gets paid for out of contingencies, and the opposition, the public, has no opportunity to question that in advance, to ask what the government plans are, because when you ask questions about contingencies, you get non-answers. That's the lack of transparency this government has in this budget. That is the full force this government is bringing down on seniors, on working families, on small businesses, at a time when all three of those groups are begging for help. This government is doing the exact opposite. So I'll have a lot more to say about this tomorrow, and my colleagues certainly will as well, because I'll tell you, if you live outside of 604, this is not a budget that seems to be caring about forest communities, that seems to be caring about people's affordability if they have a homeowner grant, seniors trying to stay in their home by using property tax deferral. I mean, I know the Premier wants to start underwriting mortgages. It makes you think he's trying to start up a credit card company with the interest rates they're starting to go to with the property tax deferral. But the fact they're even dipping into the basics that people have enjoyed in their homes to try to make ends meet. PST on a basic cable package. This government is so penned in that they have to tax people for basic cable, for landlines, for shoe repair, for buying yarn to knit sweaters. Yet they're still running record deficits, which again, I didn't hear the minister talk about. So we're supposed to believe she's on a path of fiscal responsibility and making all these hard choices and hard decisions. Yet the $10 billion deficit that was supposed to be in this year's budget, as she told us last year at this time, is now 13.3. But we're supposed to magically believe that next year's deficit will get back to that $10 billion. Even though every single budget has had a record deficit under this Premier and this Finance Minister. Every budget update winds up with it. And I know they can say, well, the last one wasn't. Well, they don't have tobacco settlements to save them this year. So we're going to keep shining a light for those seniors at home that are desperate for their pension to go a little bit farther, who have just found out that they're going to be hammered to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. The property tax deferment, $35 million extra it's going to bring in. The minister sloughed it off in her comments as it's a good thing. Yet they're budgeting to collect $35 million more off the backs of seniors that are on pensions desperate to stay in their own homes right now with the program. Apparently that's a nothing thing to the minister for them to worry about. $500 million worth of income tax increases for low-income tax bracket is nothing to worry about. $600 million on the income tax brackets being frozen is nothing to worry about. $550 million on PST being added to the services that businesses rely on every day more and more, security, bookkeeping, accounting, and to home builders on architectural costs and engineering, but nothing to worry about. This is a government that very clearly has lost the plot. They very clearly say one thing and do the exact opposite. It is not fair to seniors and working families and small businesses. It's not just for seniors, for working families and small businesses. In fact, it's downright cruel to seniors, working families and small businesses, the way this government is trying to spin this budget when we all know what the actual numbers that are going to be hitting those households are. So, Mr. Speaker, noting the time, I will reserve my place and adjourn debate.